Welcome to the Alliance Française of Washington, D.C. My name is Natasha Zawadzka. Here with us, we also have Sarah Diligenti, the Executive Director of Alliance Française, who will be actually in conversation with two authors today. So thank you for joining for this very special transatlantic book talk. With our guests today are Martha Ann Toll and Rachel Kapelke-Dale, who is actually joining from Paris. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us. It's quite late there in France right now. Martha and Rachel both recently published novels about ballet, and today they will be sharing their thoughts on writing dance, and more specifically writing about dance, which is not an easy task. Let me introduce our guests, and I will then hand it over to Sarah Diligenti to start the conversation. So Martha Ann Toll graduated from Yale University and Boston University School of Law. She has had a long career in social justice as the founding CEO of the Butler Family Fund. Martha Toll is also a widely published book critic. She wrote for NPR, Washington Post, The Millions, as well as she's also an essayist and fiction writer. In her debut novel, Three Muses won the Petritcher Prize for finely crafted fiction. Rachel Kapelke-Dale is the author of The Ingenue, which is actually coming out right now, if I'm not mistaken, right, Rachel, in a couple of days, or right?
Yep,
very soon.
That's right.
Great. And so The Ballerinas, the one she will be discussing today, and she also co-authored Graduates in Wonderland in 2014, a memoir about the significance and nuances of female friendships. Rachel's also the author of Vanity Fair Hollywood column, Advice from the Stars, and she spent herself years in intensive ballet training before receiving a bachelor from Brown University, then a master's degree from the Université de Paris 7, and a PhD from University College London. She currently lives in Paris, where she's connecting from today. And some of her earliest French classes were actually at the Alliance Française, Chicago. So 2 books, very, very different novels, yet united by the common theme, ballet, but also relationship between ballerinas with their family, with their friends, with their choreographers, the twisted relationship, I would say, which is a common theme in 2 books. Yet the novels are very different and both fascinating and beautifully written. So they are actually available at Politics Prose. I will share the link later in the chat, but yeah, you can buy them at the Union Market, Politics Prose, or the one based located on Connecticut Avenue. So I really hope that you will get a book if you haven't read it yet. Okay, so I guess I'm just not going to be taking any more time, and I'll hand it over to Sarah to start the conversation, and also ask the authors to read some passages from their books.
Thank you, Natasha. First of all, I want to show the covers of the books. So you have The Ballerinas by Rachel and Three Muses by Martha Ann. And let me say that the covers are absolutely superb. So already, you know, when you look at a book, you like the cover, it's already one way of catching my interest, and they're absolutely beautiful covers. And the books are also fascinating, both each in its own manner as a book, and also the fascination comes from, like Natasha said, the many threads and links and commonalities and items. Themes that are connected together. As we all know, for those of us who had intensive or not so intensive ballet training, ballet is from afar looks very magical, a magical world, you know, and then in truth, it's a real cruel world, as we discover when we read both books, and a cruel world of jealousy, as well of hard work, because not everyone who works really hard gets to be the star, as we discover in the book. So I will start with warm-up questions after both Rachel and Martha read a little excerpt from the respective books. So up to you, Rachel and Martha.
Rachel, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure, okay, I'm happy to dive in. So this is from just the very beginning of Ballerinas. This is the prologue. You start out as potential energy and then you fall. Before Nathalie emailed and offered to take me back, before I killed anyone, I saw variations of the same quotation everywhere. Paris is always a good idea. On mugs, on throw pillows, on Instagram. Always attributed to Audrey Hepburn, always in pink. I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, there were those fucking words. At the time, they seemed like a sign I should do it. I should go home. When I'd lived in Paris, I'd never had starry-eyed notions about what the city was, but I was perfectly ready to buy into them if they meant I could come back. Paris is always a good idea? Great. Bring on the macaron, the endless wine, the strolls along the Seine. But the truth is, I didn't know what Paris was like for most people. When you're the best at something, your world is small, your life is small. And for a few years, I was one of the best dancers on the planet. I was a member of the Paris Opera Ballet. I'd never thought about the city as extending beyond my tiny sphere of influence, which means that Paris was small for me too. Paris was my birthplace, my home for the first 23 years of my life. It was where I had my first kiss, where I met my two best friends, where I danced in 64 performances of Swan Lake, 43 Nutcrackers, 26 La Sylphides, where my mother wrenched my 3-year-old hand and ground it smarting against the wood of the bar. It's like church, okay? You know how you have to stay quiet and still during church? Just pretend like you're there. She took hold of my thigh, twisting it so my knee faced out 90 degrees to the side. Then she took the other and did the same so that my heels were touching. There, that's first position. It's like church. I mean, you're not in charge of anything, all right? The only thing you're in charge of is your own body. You start out as whole and then you break. Now, of course, it's a totally different story. I still see that quote all over the place, and it sends needles of rage shooting through my bloodstream. If I'm in a good mood, it irritates me. If I'm in a bad one, it makes me want to grab Audrey Hepburn by her bony shoulders and shake her until her teeth rattle. Always a good idea? Paris is nothing more than an empty stage. It's only as good or as bad as the people in it, and the willful naivete of that statement turns my stomach. I don't see what good it does to mythologize a city. Sure, it's pretty, but how much is pretty worth? Paris is also a place where the government massacred its citizens, lining them up against the wall of the cemetery, throwing their bodies into a huge communal trench. Paris is a place where, under siege one freezing winter, the citizens ate every animal in the zoo. Paris is a place that transported more than 10,000 children to death camps. Audrey did get one thing right, though. Paris is, more than anything else, an idea. Maybe in the end, the romantics dreaming about Paris see the same thing in the city that I do, that empty stage. A place where the rough edges are sloughed off behind the scenes, where the pain disappears behind pale pink smiles and satin, where the stage lights erase all shadows as they illuminate you with an otherworldly glow. But you start out as perfect and you become something else. So that's the prologue.
Thank you, Rachel, and it's so very true. Martha?
Thank you so much. I'm reading from the beginning of Three Muses, which also is set in Paris in the very beginning. Since it's not quite the opening, just to quickly set it up, John Curtin is a psychiatrist who is in Paris at a medical conference, and he is a survivor of a death camp. He survived because he sang as a little boy for the commandant of the camp and thus sang for his mother and his brother's killers. So he eventually makes it to New York, but with a terrible, terrible legacy of trauma, having sung for his family's killers. And he goes to the ballet. He's handed a ticket to the ballet by his boss, Dr. Leventhal's wife, and he can't turn it down. This is a problem for him because he can't be anywhere where there's music because it's too traumatizing. So that's what we're going to hear now. John settled into a bench at the edge of the plaza. Dusk was gray-pink, backlighting the opera. Ballet maids were arriving, tuxedoed men with stylish women on their arms. It wasn't just the evening gowns. or the way women drape their shawls. Their pacing and carriage were glamorous too, each with a distinctive walk, together a pageant. If he weren't answerable to Dr. Leventhal, John would have disposed of Mrs. Leventhal's ticket. He'd much rather spend the evening out here. Inevitably, he went inside. He picked up a program and made his way to the first balcony. The orchestra warmed up as a chorus took their places in the side boxes. The music began. Slow, plangent tones paced to the speed of a man's forward tread. The chorus entered, deep and serious and sad, as if their voices had taken the measure of John's memory. The curtain lifted on a snow-covered mountain against an aqua sea, a scene to conjure myth. Dancers in blue and green leapt in unison, legs like arrows, arms overhead. They fell into lines fracturing like kaleidoscope patterns, or forms in opposing mirrors. Overcome by jet lag, John dozed off. He was in his family's Mainz living room, Mutti darning socks, Papa with his pipe, left thumb over the bowl, right post to caulk his silver lighter. Lopsided smoke rings meandered toward the ceiling. A few more puffs before the pipe hung limply from Papa's mouth as he grew increasingly absorbed in the evening paper. Rubbing his eyes, John slowly woke up. He knew the music. After dinner, when Yanko's schoolwork was finished and he was getting drowsy, Papa had played it on the gramophone. If Yanko was lucky, he'd be permitted a few minutes to sit with the grown-ups before Mutti declared bedtime. The chorus sang with veneration, permeating the hall the way the smell of Mutti's bubbling apple strudel filled her kitchen, or the first peaty draughts of Papa's pipe suffused the living room. John was flooded with grief. The music piercing shorthand for what was gone. All of them. Mutti, Papa, even little Max, who hadn't been born until later. John had not thought about this music in decades, if ever. He recalled Papa starting the gramophone as Mutti settled into the horsehair chair with her sewing kit. Yanko was growing so fast, Mutti had to let out the hems of his trousers. The sewing kit was black walnut, the varnish on the edges smooth from use. It was from Yanko's grandmother. The orchestra moved with gravity and purpose, music as familiar as childhood. Now it was named Mozart's Requiem. Not only the people and the place, but this too had been stolen. John didn't need to stay. Dr. and Mrs. Leventhal would understand. Searching for the quickest exit, John struggled to call up something, anything, to stanch his anguish. What value were his sessions with his training psychiatrist? Dr. Roth was useless. None of the patrons around John budged. He would be imprisoned here until the end of the act. Making another effort, he took a deep breath to marshal his defenses. And then, a lone ballerina sheathed in white floated toward center stage. The audience greeted her with shouts of "Brava!" She was the muse of discipline. She cut through the whirling dancers with precision and exactitude. John had never seen anyone so exquisite. She was a reverie, an evocation of grace. Each fluttering arm motion dissipated his pain. Her dancing ordered the music, rendered it alluring. He strained left as she exited, as if by craning her neck he could follow her. She spun in duo with the muse of song, summoning peace and beauty. Together, the two made harmony. Their playfulness lightened John's mood. He glowed like a man feeling desire for the first time.
Thank you, Martha. Yeah, and so it's like we said, it's very fascinating books because right there you want to know what's going to happen to John, and definitely I couldn't put down either book, so I highly recommend reading them and buying them. So the link is in the chat already for all of you to see if you haven't gotten the book. So one thing I wanted to add, because of course both of you have talked about Paris in the book, and obviously ballet, like Rachel said, is something very much linked with France as well. I had many years ago, because I've been associated with Alliance Française for quite a while, but one of my former assistants back in 2010, Mary, she started learning French just because she was doing intensive ballet back on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And she wanted to be able to pronounce the word arabesque, grand jeté, plié in the proper way. And so that's how she became Francophone, a French-speaking, and actually fully bilingual and bicultural, because she eventually went to university, and then she went to ballet school as well at the opera, just for, you know, for a summer. So that was fascinating to see, because in Rachel's book there is a young American who is coming to the ballet in Paris, the POB, which Paris Opera Ballet. So to both of you, both Rachel and Martha, and my first question would be, we know, because Natasha mentioned it, that Rachel had intensive training in ballet, but maybe we want to know a little bit more about this intensive training about ballet. But what is your personal experience with ballet? Is it a physical one as a dancer, or is it a physical and appreciative one? Because like me, I've done ballet for 15 years, but then now I don't really dance anymore, but I go to look at the ballet. Or is it just appreciative? And what prompted you both to write about ballet?
So, yeah, I did train intensively, but only up until the age of about 15. And I did it in Wisconsin, which is pretty much about the opposite of Paris in many ways. But so I trained with Ballet Wisconsin and with Milwaukee Ballet. And I was injured just at that point where you really have to decide as a young dancer if you're going to commit to the 6 hours of dance a day, to 4 to 6 hours of dance, or to transition into a different kind of life. And that for me, I had to evaluate, my body's not right for it. Even if I made it, how far would I make it? And having had several months off for a hip injury, I was absolutely just drunk on the delights of normal life after so long, in this training. But I still follow the ballet. I still love the ballet. I think the one upside of a profession in which so few actually make it to becoming professionals, let alone to becoming principals or stars, is that it creates its own audience, because you have a huge set of people who have trained in their youth and who have some appreciation of and knowledge of this art form. I think the kinds of ballets that I liked in my youth, I was a horrible snob, and liked Balanchine just because I think everybody loved Balanchine. And this is all of these books were coming out, these memoirs, these, things that just really lionized him, and it was these hagiographic books. But lately, and especially writing Ballerinas and thinking a lot about what I think I saw a little twinkle in your eye, because of course in the book I do call it Paris Opera Ballet, and abbreviate it POB, but of course it's got a much more complicated name because it's the ballet of the National Opera of Paris. That was for simplicity. But they tend to do, they've expanded in recent years, but they tend to do a more classical repertoire, and that appeals to me. I think also as a writer, it's very narrative, and I really enjoy that.
So I had a somewhat similar experience. I'm one of 4 children. My mother was 4 girls, actually, very interested in giving us a full cultural education. So she put me into a ballet class at age 4. And then I think I wasn't supposed to do this, but I was absolutely smitten, which definitely presented problems because she had 3 other kids to shuttle around. So, but I was really insistent. I was really insistent on staying with it. And ultimately, I grew up in a very near-in suburb of Philadelphia. She put me in the school of the Pennsylvania Ballet, and I started commuting by myself at age 9 by train, because she couldn't handle all the carpools. I just could not get enough of it. So I had no talent, did not have the right body for it, flat feet, very inflexible. I still couldn't get enough of it. And so the experience was like 2 sides of a coin. I mean, one thing that was unbelievable was the professional company was always rehearsing. When we would come, after school, you'd see the company rehearsing, and that was just imprinted forever. That I couldn't get enough of that. I still can't. I love rehearsals. But by age 11 or 12, I mean, and I had done this very intensively. I was already on point. The school made it clear there was no future for me, and they were brutal. They were brutal. I mean, they put out a Nutcracker every year. You know, they chose who could audition. I wasn't permitted to audition for it. So finally, by age 12 or 13, they just wouldn't advance me anymore. And I was crushed. I knew that it was right, that I didn't have the right body for it. I mean, it was very apparent to me. But it came through to me like an epic failure, and it's was devastating. I guess what I can say is that I've retained this. It gave me all these gifts that people are surprised. Like, how did you do research on ballet? Well, no, I remember every single step in the classroom. I feel like I could still teach a ballet class. It's imprinted on your body. And I ultimately did a deep dive into music, and it was very interesting to me that we always had a live pianist in the studio, and it took me years to understand they were playing, you know, the best of the classical repertoire. It was a very deep musical education as well. So, and I've been a lifelong watcher of ballet. As a child, I grew up in the 60s, and Balanchine was definitely ascendant. I read every ballet review in both the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin and the New York Times. So I really, and I saw many of the Balanchine ballets as premieres when they were first done with the original dancers. I mean, everybody came to Philadelphia, which was great. And then I live in Washington, D.C. The same is true. Had a ballet subscription for decades. I think the other thing that it gave me, which was so extraordinary, this is a chicken and egg thing, but the discipline is, to me, just so admirable. And it's something that, well, my book, one of the muses is Muse of Discipline, so we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, and I think Balanchine, just for those who aren't familiar, I threw him in there without any introduction. He was the founder and choreographer at New York City Ballet. New York City Ballet for decades and decades was Balanchine. And I'll throw in just one last thing, which is that, Martha, you're absolutely right in terms of discipline, because my mother gave me this little picture. It's on my desk. I don't know if you can see, of me in an early ballet class. And just look at my posture then. I'm going, that was before any training. I was just sitting slouched over. I would never do that now. You know, she thought it was so cute. And I'm going, oh, they hadn't taught me anything yet.
Yeah, I fully agree with you both, because I, just like both of you, I started ballet when I was 4. And I stopped at 18, and I went from extremely classical ballet until the age of 15, when I sort of rebelled, and I asked to join a modern jazz class, as well as a tap dancing class, because I was so tired of the pointe. Let me put it clear, my feet were tired of the pointe, and to this day, and I'm now 60, to this day, my body suffers from what happened with the hard working with the pointe. So and I première position. I mean, while I was in France, I was showing to my nieces all the positions to take, and a few steps as well, because like you said, Martha, it's a discipline, and it's ingrained, and then you will never forget it. I can do the plié, all the bar exercise, just the same, probably not as graciously, but yeah, but it's a hard discipline. But in France, it was not Balanchine who was really the inspiration for ballet, but of course, in my family, at least in particular, we were looking at Nureyev, Rishnikov, and Plisetskaya. So that was the thing. But the one reason, and I don't know if that did that for you, but I want to say that is one of the reasons why I rebelled against the tutu is because my parents had the good idea to take me to attend a performance of The Rite of Spring with the music of Stravinsky and with the ballet. And I said, oh, but they're not wearing tutu and they're not doing pointe, so that's too. And that's why I rebelled. So anyway, that was the funny thing I wanted to mention. So when you mentioned Balanchine, both of you, but did you have any other persona or figure of ballet in mind when you wrote? Because did you have a famous ballerina in mind, or was it just George Balanchine?
So I'll start with that if that's okay. I feel that Balanchine casts a shadow over my book. I was quite purposeful. I mean, I had read a lot about him, and I read Robert Gottlieb's biography, which is quite short. But during the writing of this book, I actually stayed away from reading ballet books. I'm now on a complete tear. There's a lot of them out there that are really interesting, but I wanted him to be his own entity. So, and I did not want to do research, but I would say he cast something of a shadow. And I just want to make a point for the folks that are in the audience who may be less immersed in ballet, that the intersection between Russian and French ballet is very, very deep. And Balanchine himself fled Russia to go to France. And then I also saw Maya Plisetskaya perform, and I saw Baryshnikov and Natalia Makarova right after they defected. They came to Philadelphia, and they were performing in an outdoor venue called the Robin Hood Dell, and it was pouring. So they had, I'd say, a quarter of the stage that they could use because the rest of it was soaked. It was quite amazing to see it. But anyway, so I would say I often don't mention Balanchine at all when I'm talking about my book, because I really wanted him in the background. The other person who was in my book in a somewhat minor role is a character named Simon Worthington, who is modeled on John Crenko, who was a famous British choreographer who was thrown out of Britain because he was gay, and made fantastic ballets at the Stuttgart Ballet.
And you, Rachel?
So no, there were no particular characters that I had in mind while writing this. I think there are a few aspects of characters that those familiar with, I'm not going to say the ballet world, because when a lot of this was happening, I was 10 years old in Wisconsin, like I knew, but the ballet world autobiographies, like Elsie Kirkland's books were, so fascinating to me. And she writes about, Peter Martins, and she writes about, Baryshnikov. And at the same time, I was growing up on these movies, these kind of, they date very funnily. I think Turning Point dates probably a little better than White Nights, which comes off as absolutely, this Cold War, carryover where he's tearing up his passport, and they're forcing him to dance. But you get Helen Mirren speaking Russian. It's a strange movie. It's wonderful. I love the dancing in it, but you have these very kind of Hollywood sexy exteriors a lot of the time for the men. The men, I think, are considered, a real male superstar in ballet is treated, I think, in the book, I say, like gold dust. And that's a really interesting component of an art form that is purportedly, and I think Martha's choreographer says this in the book, it's all about woman. It's about, it's about women. So why are we fetishizing? Well, it's the defections, Nureyev as well, but all of these really big names of 20th century dance. I think almost anybody off the street could name Baryshnikov, but if you ask them to name one female dancer, how many could name, Margot Fontaine even, or somebody asked, it's Suzanne Farrell. I got into a lovely correspondence when I was a child, and fangirled out on ballerinas, and she wrote me the longest letter back to the letter that I'd sent her to her publisher, Meryl Ashley, very close to my heart for that reason. But so no, for me it was also about keeping in mind the way that ballet does have this kind of cult of personality, but wanting to step away from the cult that we know. I think that those that we're used to, in a way, and say, well, if you didn't know anything about these people, if you were just, living in this, and there were totally new characters, and they didn't have the name of a Balanchine or a Nureyev of a this, that, if they're called Jacques and Margot and, all of these, well, what are your expectations then? to play with that a little.
It's interesting to think that a lot of Hollywood stars who danced with among most famous men, Fred Astaire, but Sid Harris and Leslie Caron were both classically trained, extremely beautiful ballerinas who ended up dancing modern and tap dancing. So and also it's very interesting to think that in France, the person or the personality responsible for really ballet is none other than Louis XIV, because he was a ballet dancer and he wanted to include ballet in all of the music and the performances at Versailles. So ballet is nothing new in France, it really is. But it seems like fetishizing women, and especially when you think of the paintings of Degas, and they come to mind when we look at both your covers. At your covers, we absolutely, the ballerina, the three muses, especially Martha's cover with, doing the chanson, that's, you bring Degas, so you think about this fetishizing of the human or the female body and the fantasies of the men, but at the same time, when you read the book, you realize how it is still is a man's world, basically. So that's a very, very interesting. The theme that thread both of your book beyond ballet is the theme of abuse. So in the three muses, the three Martha's book, in three muses, we have both characters, John and Katia, who are in a way victims of abuse, except one chooses to be abused, the woman, and John is a victim of abuse in the concentration camp. He doesn't have a choice. He is abused, psychologically in the concentration camp. And then in the ballerina, all of the characters are somehow, all of them victim of abuse, whether they are principal, Delphine's mother, she, abused a body, because ballet is discipline, as we both, all of us said, but it's also abusing your body, forcing your body into shapes that are not natural, right? It's a form of abuse, but it's also abuse between the girls because of the competition, the fierce, the cruel competition to become the principal or the soloist, and also to let others abuse you in a relationship like we just mentioned, men, women, a world of power. For instance, Delphine against Lindsay, or Lindsay's husband eventually, of Delphine and her lover, or even that teachers who are really not nice with them, and even Margot, who has a sort of not a healthy relationship with herself in the book, and Jack, of course, one of Delphine's lovers. So can you extrapolate on the theme of the abuse, and is it something that really you had in mind when you started writing the book? Did you, and then Martha, I know you mentioned you didn't research anything for the book, but did you?
Yeah.
The abuse came as a theme, or did you know that it was going to take you there, that direction, or did it develop when you were both writing your book?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I did research for the book, but I stayed away from reading certain ballet books because I had to. I was afraid of, I was afraid of suggestibility, basically. So in my book, Katya, whom John falls in love with, as we just heard, and in a sort of a fairy tale way, he falls in love with this ballerina. He's a psychiatrist. He knows much better than to do that, but he does anyway. And he is enmeshed in a relationship with her choreographer, which is definitely abusive. This is the scene that we just heard took place in 1963. There's backstory from 1944 forward, and I just felt that I was dealing with reality. I was actually at publication when I realized I needed to put a quote trigger warning on the back of the book, because the relationship between Katya and her choreographer Boris Yannikov is very complicated. It's definitely abusive. It's definitely screams Me Too, but it works in many ways for both of them. Katya is an ambitious person, and he is her ticket to the stage. So that's one aspect of it, where she totally admires his genius, and he is who gives her the stage. But she has a second problem, which is that she ends up being a co-creator. I know that Rachel just mentioned this, what a male-dominated world is, particularly in the world of choreography, who are the people who make dances. And Katya is really a co-creator with Yannikov in terms of making the dances, and she never gets any public credit for it. She never gets any credit for it. So that is a huge frustration of hers. And the whole constellation, her relationship with Yannikov, the abuse, and there's also love in there, and the co-creation feels very 1950s to me, and I think was really not only accepted, but somewhat celebrated. I could list, we all could, many, many, many such relationships which are well known and were not only condoned, but sanctioned.
I think on my end, there were certain things with ballet that are common to ballet stories that I was not going to touch with a 10-foot pole. I think if you write about eating disorders, particularly in certain ways, for example, you're basically giving instruction manuals. There are lots of traps, I think, and lots of stories that have already been told, and some stories that have dealt with these subject matters very well. But it became really clear to me as I started writing about particularly the Paris Opera Ballet. One of the reasons for which I chose it is that it's extremely hierarchical, which I would say all very classical companies are. That is beginning to change in some companies, thankfully. But I think anytime you have this hierarchy, which again, began back with Louis XIV, it literally came from the most hierarchical court of probably all time, the first school, the first, there are so many firsts when it comes to ballet in France. And yet I think, Delphine is returning to Paris and thinking about her personal relationships. But I think there's a lot that is out of her control, because she's going, well, I entered this system at 3, and beyond that, it just, it's once you've made that first decision, it just becomes more and more extreme. We're using the word abuse a lot, and it makes me think of the French expression, c'est abusé, it's just like, it's so extreme, but you have to build to that, and you're making all of these little choices. But it's like you made this first choice, and for Delphine, her mother, leads her to it. That you don't start out with the extreme. If you started out putting a toddler, in 8-hour-a-day, sessions of, character and, the bar and point and floor bar and Pilates and this and that. I mean, it's impossible. You couldn't do it. But you start out with it's a gradual thing, and it builds and it develops. And I think the hierarchies are like that. And you still see very few women at the top of companies. You see a lot of, Wendy Whelan is now, I believe, co-director, artistic director at New York City Ballet, which is wonderful to see. She's a wonderful dancer who had a very long career, a surprisingly long career. She danced until about 50. Sorry, I'm going so off track there. What's that?
Wendy Whelan is a beautiful documentary of Wendy Whelan.
Oh yes, I love that documentary. But yeah, and it's a predominantly female world, but at the upper levels, it's quite male. And I think we've seen that play out in different institutions over the past few years. Women's gymnastics in the United States is one example. Places where there are a lot of young women in vulnerable positions. Even if they're vulnerable from their own choices, as Martha points out, they still have desires. They're still autonomous beings, with these wishes and with this desire to advance. But it's a system that's able to twist those desires to serve the ends that, that can turn out quite dark.
Okay, a couple more questions before I open it to the public. First of all, both of you were immersed in ballet terminology. So did your knowledge of French help or not?
Well, your story earlier reminded me of how when I learned French, which was I thought, oh, the animals are so easy because, of course, you have all of the animal steps in ballet. You know, you have pas de chat, which, without trying to do some horrible 20 years late dancing here, is a jump where your legs move like a cat. You have, pas de cheval, where you're literally, flicking your foot like a horse. Pas de chèvre, which is a little jump. All of these animal names. So yeah, my first experience of French was through ballet, and then later through the Alliance, and then school because we were preparing for the very great pleasure of spending some time here. This summer I was 10, so yeah, that was my link between the two. Knowing French, I think, does help. Definitely
Yeah.
help.
I learned French because I grew up in an American house full of Francophiles, and no, I didn't understand the totally bastardized English pronunciations until I had been a French student for a while, and I was, oh, that actually means something. They're totally mispronouncing it. I did have the other thing that I had that it taken me well into adulthood to understand some of the most celebrated teachers in the world, and I didn't understand it. I mean, I read about them in books. They were just our ballet teachers. Pennsylvania Ballet took, because Philadelphia is so close to New York, there were a lot of people who commuted down from New York, and a lot of really, really famous teachers that I knew nothing about. I'm going to just quick say that I am now doing an immersive dive into ballet books, as I said, and I've reviewed a whole lot of them, and I'm writing about it a lot. So I've written a bunch of stuff for Point magazine, which is a ballet magazine, and also Fjord, which is a Canadian based. I think it's Canadian based. So I'm just going to type my website in the chat if you want to find them. It's you take a look. Anyway, thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Sarah.
Yeah. So to both of you, as well as if you read, all of your potential readers will notice that obviously the two choreographers, strong male older figures who dominate those, Katya and Delphine, are both Russians. So I was wondering whether the baddie had to be Russian. Was it a new trend, or was it something because you may have both lived or visited Russia or been exposed to the ballet world in Russia? And I want to pick up on Rachel, especially, who in page 220 in her book talks about Helen Mirren, and you just mentioned her as well. But did you know that Helen Mirren was actually Russian?
I did know that. Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, she's wonderful. I didn't have-
Elena Mironov.
Yeah. But so for me, the important thing was that Delphine does the reversal of what we were seeing in the second half of the 20th century with several very big name dancers, Nureyev and Baryshnikov, chief among them. She does the reversal of going from the West back to Russia, and it's another. The schools of dance are similar. They're not identical, though. Especially she's at she's in St. Petersburg. So for me, it was about getting her there, and that made the choreographer Russian. And for me, this also played. It's interesting because it plays into a lot of movie tropes about like Air Force One and the Russian baddies and these kind of action just very black and white figures. But for me, Baryshnikov was one of my first crushes. He was, an absolute god. And so same, I didn't have a crush on Balanchine, but who was also Russian, and, also thought of him as just this towering figure who could do no wrong. And so I wanted to twist that a little bit, while playing on some of those Hollywood tropes. In the ballet world, they're seen one way, whereas I think popular culture sees them in another way. So, because ballet is not necessarily the most popular art form, although we do have a cultural fascination with it.
And I would say it wasn't intentional. I didn't really think about it, but I'm sure that I was channeling Balanchine. And the irony of Balanchine is he kind of invented American ballet, and he was very aware of this, and he dressed the part. He always wore a bolo tie. He dressed in Western clothing, with a bolo tie and denim shirts and a red bandana. And he really wanted to be an American, I think. So, so I'll just leave it at that.
So I have a question for each of you this time now. So one for Martha and one for Rachel in particular, and linked with the book. So Martha, I will start with you first. So why did you thread the Holocaust into the story? Because your book, the cover, the title, Three Muses, you know, it's all when you look at it like that, when you don't dig into in the book first, you realize that you think it's going to be completely only about ballet, but it's not. And I had so much empathy for John. I mean, I cried. I mean, I couldn't help but cry with his story. It was, you know, I thought like, oh, I hope she's going to write another book just about him, you know. So why did you thread the Holocaust into the book?
I never know how to answer that. And I think this audience knows that authors really have nothing to do with their covers, but I do want to, it's hard to see, but there's actually barbed wire going across the cover, which I thought was a good way to show that it was more than a ballet book. I mean, I will say that I grew up in a Jewish family, not a very secular Jewish family, but the Holocaust is hugely part of my upbringing. I'm in a generation where our parents, my friends' parents were Holocaust survivors. There were members of my family who were murdered in Auschwitz. And particularly in a secular family, in some ways, the Holocaust was my first introduction to being Jewish. You knew about it, even if you didn't know anything about Jewish ritual. And the older that I've gotten, the more it is, closer it is to my life. It's incredibly recent history. It's incredibly recent history. And the magnitude is something that I think is not possible for us to understand. So I always wanted to write about it. And I believe strongly, a lot of people say this about narrative, that sometimes you can tell a story much more clearly when you're talking about one person than when you're talking about 6 million people being killed. So I wouldn't say it was really intentional. I would say that both characters came to me at the same time, and I felt that they needed to interact. And Katya, who's the ballerina, is dealing with her own set of trauma. It's hard to compare trauma, but not really on the scale of John. But her mother is killed as she's a child, and I was interested in the fairy tale quality of how they meet and how they could interact. But I think a lot of it was unconscious. I think they were both important topics to me.
I must say that I wished for a happy ending, but I knew it couldn't be.
Wait, that's a spoiler. Don't say anything.
But I was wishing for a happy ending when I was reading the book, and I knew it was not going to be. But I didn't want to rush to the end to see, and I kept it, and so that's why I cried so much. And for you, Rachel, I have the specific question: is that I was very much interested. So when Delphine comes back from Russia to France, and then she finds again her girlfriends, and she realizes that everybody has changed, and that she probably didn't, do a lot to sort of cultivate these friendships from far away, not enough. So she didn't thank the wedding, she didn't realize Margot had a girlfriend, so she comes a bit of, and been trying to have a child while Lindsay refuses to have a child. And so what really struck me at that time is this, I think this place where you say something about women being considered as I think one of them, I think it's Lindsay maybe, who says that, as a walking uterus. And so you have tackled the issue of motherhood and fatherhood in the ballet world. And so I was wondering, because we also had in the ballet world in the last 20 years, we also had the issue of minority and of body, and of the fact that whether an African-American, body can actually dance a woman, I'm talking about a woman, can dance a sylphide, for instance, in the same way as in France, we had for many years ago, at least 30 or 35 years ago, we had Surya Bonali, who was an ice skating figure from African-French ice skating figure, who was the shock. All the French people used all these, nice little ice skaters, white and everything. So I want to touch about that femininity as well as feminism within the ballet world, linked with motherhood and the different body and different image. So what brought you to talk about that?
I think, yeah, it's a very complex question. I think a lot of it for me was that I had so I had done my master's here, as we mentioned earlier in the session, but I left when I was 26 for London. When I came back, I was 33, which now seems to me, but at the time I was going, I'm so much older. But of course now I'm going, that's basically the same age. But but I had friends, who were married, friends who were having kids, in a way that I think is much more common, when you're 33 than when you're 26. And so you see people in these different life stages, and especially with the women, the way that that it starts to, it can, in some cases, change your conception of yourself. And in other cases, it doesn't. But I think that people who become mothers and don't take that on as a core identity really get punished socially for that. I think, I think women who choose to remain child-free get punished for that, socially as well. And I think that this is another interesting thing for me that I didn't realize I was writing about at the time, but of course, as a lot of people know about the absolutely incredible social safety net that France has here, for maternity leave, for familial leave, for these kinds of things. But that run counter to this other culture, this mini culture within the ballet world. And you saw actually during the pandemic, there were interviews with a few dancers who chose to have their first child or their only child in that period, because they were going, oh, okay, there are no shows on. I can do this because it's going to change my body and my presentation and my, and it'll take me longer to get into a shape, get my sense of gravity back, it's a different gravity. It's a different balance. It's a different, it's a different presentation. What I keep coming back to with ballerinas is that it really is a study of a microcosm, but it is about women more generally, and it's about a particular place, but it is also about, I think the way, just in the West in particular, even in America, because it's set in France, but it's written for a primarily American Anglophone audience. At the time, I had no idea if foreign rights would sell. That was what I knew. That's where I knew the book was going. There are things that there are these tiny things that you can take and project out. With the walking uterus comment, I think that's Delphine says it to Lindsay's husband, who wants her to have a baby. And I think this is something that comes from Delphine and the other women, to lesser extent in the book, the other ballerinas, have thought about their body's functions for so long, and a lot less about their body's desires and what that desire means, what those desires, how those desires shape the world around them and how the world responds to them. And I think Delphine's becoming more and more aware of this and more angry about this. Yeah.
Say that I would have tons of more questions, because I would like to explore with you the aspect of both Katia and Delphine being a little bit narcissistic, so much so that she doesn't even realize her mom is dying of cancer, Delphine in Delphine's, and that's because there's ambition that nourishes their narcissism, maybe, or the fact that as a ballet dancer you have to look at yourself in the mirror all the time, so you end up only liking yourself. I mean, I remember that from all these ballet classes I did, and really I found both of your books absolutely fascinating, and highly recommend their reading if you have not read them. But I would love to continue that, but I need to let anybody ask questions, and I think we have one from Lane.
We have one from Lane. So it's a question to Rachel. What was your journey from ballet to writing?
Well, they were parallel journeys at the very beginning. I I have to say my parents are both English professors and writers. So we're a bit of a circus family, and that everybody, my little sister's a poet, my older sister is a widely published writer and researcher on public health. So we all have our own specialties. When I left ballet, and I always thought, wow, like looking at mom and dad's careers compared to my, the careers of my parents' friends, where they're going into work 9 to 5, this and that. My parents always seemed to be at home reading and writing. I mean, they worked incredibly hard. They must have, teaching and doing their own writing and, continuing to keep up with literature and philosophy and all of these things. But to me, I thought, wow, that looks pretty good. So, when I quit ballet, I thought, oh God, I guess I'm going to have to be a writer, just because with my family, it felt like the expected path. And of course, my hubris was immediately punished, because then I spent the next 20 years trying to write and sell a book, which should, teach me a good lesson there. But yeah, I think I'd been writing the whole time, from very little onwards. So, yeah, I think it was important for me to live life outside of the ballet world for a while, to be able to go back and write about it in what I hope is a meaningful way. And so I was very, very pleased that this ended up being my first novel.
Talking about writing, I want to ask Martha, what is her experience about these writing retreats that I know, because I follow you. So I know you've been going to all those writers retreat and writing retreat in Maine and other places. And I know you write your blog, and I follow your blog and I read it. So how does that help a writer develop into writing to do these retreats?
So I have a really similar story to Rachel. I grew up in a house with writing in the water supply. My mother was a professional editor and copy editor, and in those days, everything was on paper, and the dining room table was always covered with galleys. Like you, Rachel, I wasn't aware always that she was working, because she worked school hours. I mean, you knew the manuscripts were all over the place. And then my dad was a lawyer, and he was a maniac about writing. I mean, he wrote a lot, not on legal subjects. So writing there was huge dictionary next to the dining room table, along with an encyclopedia. Anyway, writing was in the water supply. And so I ultimately went to law school, very reading and writing intensive profession, and spent 30 plus years working as a lawyer and also in social justice. Very, very, very intensive writing. So somewhere along the way in the early 2000s, I started writing fiction, and I was working full time. So a couple of friends of mine kept saying, you need to nourish the writing side. Like Rachel, I had 20 years of rejections before I published my first novel. And the writing, and I think, Rachel, you may be the same. Well, you have a PhD, but I didn't have any writing education. I think your PhD is more on the scholarship side than on the creative writing side. Is that correct?
It's in cinema, actually.
Cinema. Okay, so neither of us. I mean, if you talk to a lot of writers right now, a lot of people get a master's in fine arts. I didn't spend any time in a classroom. I mean, I felt like 7th grade was my classroom. My parents redlining all my papers, but so the thing that writing retreats have done for me, which is you are essentially fed and housed, and your job is to sit in a studio and write all day. It was like manna from heaven. I mean, I was raising children, and I had a full-time job that had nothing to do with what I was writing about. So it was just they've been the greatest gifts, because your brain, you need a lot of mental real estate to write a novel. And it was a way to completely open up and take a break. The last year, 2019, I got 2 spectacular, you have to apply, you get rejected a lot, but I got 2 incredible fellowships. One was in southern France and one was in Maine, as Sarah mentioned. And I'm like, I had to take leave without pay, because I was leaving for a month at a time. And then I'm like, what is wrong with this picture? Every 3 months I'm leaving my job for a month. So ultimately, I stepped away, but at a much older age, when I could afford it. My kids were done college and stuff like that. So Yes, I love writing retreats. I'm going to another one in February. I feel like you're like blessed to do what you want to do, and your work is your art, and it's been an incredible, amazing gift for me.
That is so very interesting, because I'm like you, Martha. For so many years, I've started writing when I was 8. Okay, and I've had a few poems there and that, essay published back in France, in the United States, etc. But this last month that I was in France, it was my writer's retreat sort of thing, because that's what I did. I sat at my brother's-in-law, table, and I told him, don't tell anyone I came. It's separated from my half sister. Okay, so nobody in the family knew, no friends. And I sat and I wrote, apart from walking his dog, who loves me now because I was walking him every 3 hours, like to feed it for 15 minutes. But I was writing from 9 a.m. until 6 or 7 p.m. And then in November, the second half of November, a little bit less, but still a lot. And I progressed a lot. So who knows? But I like what you said, that we need the real estate time to write. Yeah. It is true. Yeah, and to see, and yeah, absolutely. It's so fascinating to see that, even though we have and I love that both of you, I find it so refreshing that both of you have not done a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing, because you know that in France 99% of authors have not done any fine arts or creative writing degree. It only started about a year ago or two, then that they started offering those masters in France, but everybody else, I mean, Camus never did that, Sartre never did that. All of these great writers, even the newer one, nobody has done that. It's just a question of, it's not like ballet, right? But it is.
So I had this incredible experience last night. I went to hear the writer Yiyun Li, who's a fabulous writer. She grew up in China. She came to America to study science and then learned English in her late 20s. And she's a spectacular writer. And she's now on the writing faculty of Princeton. And she gave a talk last night, and it was so refreshing. She said, I hate all that terminology that's used in MFA programs. I don't care about plot. You don't need plot unless you're writing a murder mystery. I was like, thank you so much. I don't know what agency means. That's a writing term they always hear, just the character of agency. Another thing you always hear in writing land is, what are the stakes? She goes, I don't care about stakes. I was like, thank you very much. She grew up in China and she'd never heard of anybody getting a writing education.
I will say, though, for any aspiring writers in the audience, that just to play devil's advocate here, is that my father did do an MFA, but he did it in his late 30s. So for him, what that was, and it was funded. So for him, that was I don't want to say a 2 years long writing retreat. He'll probably murder me, but it was a lot of work. And yes, I think there is this, there is this ethos and terminology. It's not something I would have wanted to do right out of college, which is what, I wanted to work. I wanted to do other things. I wanted to find things to write about, because I think you can have, especially when you're born into, a reading and writing family, you can write a good sentence when you're 22, but I think very few people, some do, some have things to say. I did not. So I had to go, live life and do that. And the same thing with my father. And, I think so. I think it acted kind of as a 2 year long, space for him to explore that. So I think it can be really useful for some people, and some of us find our way in absolutely other ways.
I do agree with that, and I also feel like this is not about you have to do your time, whether you do it in school or not in school. You there's a long apprenticeship, even if you're not in a classroom, to learn how to be a writer.
I'd say that my mother had a funny life moment in her mid-20s where she was thinking about going back to school for medical school. She did the math and she said, by the time I'm a full-fledged doctor, I'm going to be 30. And her advisor looked at her and said, well, honey, you're going to be 30 one day anyway. So, you live your life, you do what you want to be doing, because, it's because that doesn't matter. If you're loving what you're doing, you'll get the material anyway.
That's true. Well, thank you to both of you for the fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. So I hope that one day, Rachel, whenever you come to DC, please come and visit us at the Alliance Française. You're, after all, part of the Alliance Française family since you learned French at the Alliance Française in Chicago. And and we would love to have Martha. You know, we've met her before, so she came to one of the film festival we had in 2019. So we hope to have you at another event. Maybe have a signing for you, a signage event. So when it's possible for both of you.
Well, lovely. Thank you so much for hosting and for the thoughtful questions, and for including me in this wonderful discussion.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Rachel. And Rachel, I just want to give a plug. Do you have the cover of your next book? It's coming out on Tuesday. Can't wait to read it.
Thank you. I don't mind if I do. It is right here. This is The Ingenue. It is set in Milwaukee. So I'm sorry for the lack of a French connection there. It's about a former...
Milwaukee, because I see that Lane said she's from Alliance Française Minneapolis.
Yes.
Française in Milwaukee. Let me know if you want to speak with for them at Alliance Française Milwaukee. I know the director.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. And yes, I will be in Minneapolis to sign books in a couple of weeks. So hopefully Lane can get her copy. And I'm really excited. But Ballerinas was my first novel, and it's such an interesting world to talk about. And I'm very spoiled to have two experts to discuss it with in this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.